In the early summer of 1994, every planter in Lubbock County, Texas, was running cotton. The red dirt moved in low clouds behind the equipment, and the gin trucks pulled steady along the farm-to-market roads from field to compress, and the sound that Lubbock County made in June was the sound it had always made. Iron and diesel, and the particular grind of a planter unit dropping seed into cracked calichy soil at 5 miles an hour. Cotton was the crop. It had been the crop for 2 generations, and in 1994, even with margins thinner than the boom years, it was still what the South Plains ground was understood to be for. George M. Groce was not running cotton that summer. He was cutting alfalfa, or rather, he was cutting what alfalfa looks like in its establishment year. Low and blue-green and uneven in places, the kind of stand that makes a man slow his truck on the county road and squint because it suggests something went wrong in the seeding. Nothing had gone wrong. 2 neighboring farmers had stopped at the fence line that morning while George was running the mower. They were laughing. Not quietly. George did not look up. He kept the tractor moving down the row, hat pulled low, jaw set, eyes on the field ahead. The cut material was too thin to bale. There was nothing here to sell. He hauled it to the field edge and left it there. In year 1, it paid nothing. He had written that down in November 1993, and he had dated it, and he had known it before he ever turned the key. Welcome back, and thank you. Every view, every comment, every share of this series tells me you're finding something worth your time in these stories. And I don't take that lightly. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the moment. Hit that button and stay with us, because this chapter is where the story starts to turn. There is a particular kind of thinking that happens at a kitchen table in November, after harvest is done and before the next year's inputs have to be committed. The fields are quiet, the gin runs are finished, and if you are George and you have been watching your net margin shrink for 3 consecutive years, without being able to name exactly why, you stop asking the seasonal question and start asking the decade question. November 19th, 1993. He writes the date at the top of the page. The question he was working through wasn't what cotton was worth that year. He knew that number. Lint at 65 cents a pound, 900 pounds per acre, gross of $585. Direct costs running roughly $310 an acre once you tallied seed, fertilizer, chemicals, irrigation, gin fees, and a fair share of equipment and overhead. Net somewhere around $275 before land and debt service. A number that had been $290, then $282, and was now $275. The direction was not ambiguous. What George was asking, and what nobody else in the county, as far as he could tell, was sitting down to ask, was what that number looked like across 10 years compared to something else across the same span. He ran alfalfa. Year 1 in alfalfa was ugly. Establishment costs, stand development, a full season with limited yield. You were looking at negative $180 per acre. There was no way around it. You were buying into something. The first year was a debt against the future. But year 3 was different. By year 3, a well-established alfalfa stand on irrigated West Texas ground was netting around $118 per acre. Below cotton's $275, yes, considerably below it. But the comparison George was making wasn't year to year. It was structural. The alfalfa number was stable, it was contractible. It did not carry a gin fee that reset every fall or a boll weevil pressure bill that arrived uninvited. It did not require defoliant. It did not require replanting after a bad stand year. The curves, when he drew them out, crossed somewhere around year 4 or 5, depending on where cotton prices went, and his read of where they were going was not optimistic. He wasn't certain. He was careful not to be. But he was asking a question that had an answer you could work with, and that was more than cotton had been giving him. He closed the notebook. Outside, the pivot sat still over ground his father had broken. The ground had not changed. George was beginning to dot November 19th, 1993. He writes the date at the top of the page. There is a particular kind of thinking that happens at a kitchen table after harvest is done and before the next year's inputs have to be committed. The fields are quiet. The gin runs are finished. The equipment is put up. And if you are George, and you have watched your net margin decline for 3 consecutive years without being able to name a single catastrophic cause, you stop asking the seasonal question and start asking the decade question. The seasonal question was one he knew the answer to. Cotton lint running 65 cents a pound. 900 pounds per acre off his ground if the year cooperated. Gross of $585 an acre. Direct costs: seed, fertilizer, chemicals, irrigation, gin fees, a proportional share of equipment and overhead, landing at roughly $310. Net around $275 before land and debt service. A number that had been $290 the year before that and $282 the year before that. The direction was not difficult to read. What George was working through that November, and what nobody else in the county appeared to be sitting down to work through, was what that number looked like plotted across 10 years alongside something else plotted across the same span. He ran alfalfa. Year 1 was not a comfortable number to write down. Establishment costs, stand development, a full growing season with limited harvestable yield. You were looking at negative $180 per acre. The first year of alfalfa was not a crop. It was an investment in the possibility of a crop, and there was no disguising that. But year 3 looked different. A well-established alfalfa stand on irrigated ground in his part of Texas was netting roughly $118 per acre by the 3rd season. Below cotton's $275, considerably below it. That gap was real, and George did not minimize it on the page. What he was looking at instead was the structure of each number. The alfalfa figure was stable. It was contractible with a dairy or a feed yard. It did not carry a gin fee that reset every October, a defoliant application, a boll weevil management cost that arrived based on regional pressure rather than anything he controlled. It did not require replanting after a poor stand year. Once the stand was established, the cost floor was lower, and it stayed lower. He drew the curves out across a 10-year span. They crossed somewhere around year 4 or 5, depending on assumptions about cotton prices, and his read of where cotton prices were heading was not optimistic. He was not certain. The notebook was careful not to claim certainty, but the question he was asking had a shape to it, a trajectory you could follow, and that was more than cotton had been offering him for 3 years running. He closed the notebook. The pivot sat still over his father's ground. The ground had not changed. George was beginning to. Beneath the field, something else was happening. Something slower than a bad cotton year and quieter than a declining price, but more permanent than either. The center pivot was pulling from the Ogallala aquifer, the same vast underground formation that had been watering the entire South Plains since the region first put pivots in the ground. And since the 1970s, under Lubbock County, it had been measurably, consistently declining. Not dramatically, not in a way that made headlines any given year, just down, reliably, quietly down. In the way that a thing goes when you draw from it continuously and put nothing back. George's water table had dropped 18 feet in a decade. His pump was working harder to reach what remained. The electricity required to lift that water to the surface and push it out through the pivot had climbed from $2,800 in 1986 to $4,100 in 1993. That was not a rate spike or a bad year on the utility bill. That was a structural shift, the aquifer retreating deeper, the lift distance growing longer, the cost of irrigation rising independent of anything George planted or decided. Cotton's relationship with water made this particularly punishing. The crop's critical window, first square through open bowl, was narrow and unforgiving. Miss an irrigation set during those weeks and the yield loss was permanent. There was no recovering it later in the season, no making up what the plant needed when it needed it. Cotton demanded what it had always demanded and offered no accommodation for an aquifer that was no longer where it used to be. Alfalfa worked from a different part of the soil entirely. An established stand develops a taproot system deep enough to access subsoil moisture that cotton roots never reach, a zone of the profile that had been sitting there, unavailable to every cotton crop George had ever grown. And its total seasonal water demand ran approximately 35% lower than cotton's requirement on his ground. He held that percentage against his actual irrigation bill. 35% of $4,100 was $1,435 per year. Not an estimate built on optimism. A figure derived from documented alfalfa water use applied to what he was already spending on electricity to run a pump that was working harder every season. He wrote it down and looked at it for a long time. What held his attention was not just the size of the number. It was its direction. The aquifer was not going to recover. The water table was not going to rise. Every additional foot of decline would widen the gap between what cotton demanded and what alfalfa required, in real dollars, on a real electricity bill, every year going forward. The slow problem beneath the field was not going to stop being a problem. But it was, if he moved now, going to become someone else's problem at a rate he could calculate. He had been staring at a cost. He was beginning to see it as an argument. George seeded the alfalfa in March of 1994. By June, if you were driving the county road and happened to slow down at the fence line, what you saw was not impressive. The stand was thin in places, low, patchy in the way that an establishing alfalfa field always is, and that nobody who hasn't grown one through its first season knows how to read. It did not look like a crop. It looked like a field that hadn't fully decided what it wanted to be. Two of George's neighbors stopped at the fence one morning while he was running the mower over a stand that, from the road, didn't appear to justify mowing. They did not stay long. There wasn't much to say that took long to say. They laughed, got back in the truck, and drove on. Within a week, the county grapevine had rendered its verdict. George Groce was throwing good ground away on hay. The county was not being cruel. It was reading what it could see, the way it had always read fields, by what was visible above the surface, measured against what that ground had produced before. And measured that way, the comparison was not close. Cotton at 900 pounds of lint per acre was a known quantity. A thin, establishing alfalfa stand in its first summer was not producing that. It was not producing anything close to that. The ground looked worse than it had in any cotton year George could remember. What the county could not see was what was happening below the surface. The taproot system of an established alfalfa stand does not develop quickly, and it does not develop visibly. It goes down 2 feet, 3 feet, probing towards subsoil moisture and structural depth that no annual crop ever builds. The thin stand along the fence line was not the crop. It was the foundation of the crop. George was not farming 1994. He was building the infrastructure that would support 4 to 5 cuttings per year for the next 4 years, without requiring him to replant, reestablish his weed pressure management, reset his chemical program, or absorb another year-one cost structure. He was not comparing 1994 alfalfa to 1994 cotton. He was comparing a 3-year cost profile to another 3-year cost profile, and he had done that math the previous November at a kitchen table with a notebook and a pen. The county did not have that frame. It had the frame that cotton farming in West Texas had always provided: seasonal, annual, yield per acre this year against yield per acre last year. It was not a wrong frame for what it was designed to measure. It simply could not see what George was measuring, because what George was measuring wasn't visible yet. He kept mowing. The taproot kept going down. The neighbors kept their verdict. By the time the stand proved them wrong, George would be 2 years into a cost structure they hadn't thought to compare it against. 1995 arrived and the stand filled in. Not dramatically, not all at once, but by the time the first cutting was ready that spring, the field had become something a passing truck could read correctly. George took 2 cuttings to a feed yard operation south of Lubbock and held a third in the barn while he worked through the terms of a supply contract with a cattle operation to the east. The contract wasn't signed yet, but the conversation was the kind that had a direction to it. In November, he opened the notebook. Year 2, actual figures landed within $11 per acre of what he had projected sitting at the kitchen table 22 months earlier. $11. He wrote the real numbers in beside the projected ones and looked at how close the 2 columns ran. The model had held. The thing he had been accused of gambling on had behaved almost exactly the way the math said it would. He updated every line and closed the notebook. Across the county road and a section to the south, Dale Pruitt was having a different kind of year. The export demand that had kept cotton lint above 70 cents through the early part of the decade was softening, and the price was following it down. Dale's chemical costs had moved up again. Gin fees had not corrected in any direction that helped him. His operating note at the bank had come up for renegotiation, and the new rate was taking a larger share of his gross before it ever reached him as income. The treadmill George had described to himself in the November 1993 notebook, costs that reset to zero every March regardless of what the previous year had given you, was turning faster on Dale's ground than it had been. Dale said nothing about George's alfalfa. Not directly. Not at the co-op, not at the fuel stop. The verdict the county had delivered the year before was harder to repeat, now that the field looked like what it was supposed to look like, and there is a particular silence that replaces a confident wrong opinion once the evidence starts moving the other way. That fall, the county extension office in Lubbock published a newsletter examining alfalfa economics for South Plains irrigated ground, the cost structure of establishment, the water use comparison against cotton, the break-even timeline, the per-acre net projection at year 3. George read it carefully, the way you read something you already know. Every number on the page was a number he recognized. The irrigation differential, the establishment loss in year 1, the stabilization curve through years 2 and 3. He had run this calculation at his kitchen table before the extension office had put it in print, without the extension office's data sets, with nothing but a notebook and a cost sheet and a question about what the next decade looked like rather than the next season. He set the newsletter down. The contract to the east signed the following week. 1996 was the year the math arrived. The stand was full. 4 cuttings came off across the season, and the feed yard supply contract that had been negotiating its way toward a signature for the better part of a year was confirmed at $48 per ton delivered. George had a buyer, a price, and a field that was producing at the rate the November 1993 notebook had said it would produce. He ran the numbers: 180 acres, 4 cuttings, 4.5 tons per acre, average, across the season. Gross revenue of $155,520. Against that, irrigation for the year came in at $2,665, down 35% from the $4,100 he had been running when the pivot was pulling for cotton. Cutting, baling, hauling, stand maintenance fertilizer, no nitrogen program, no herbicide, no insecticide, no defoliant, no gin fees. Total direct cost for the full 180 acres landed at $13,400. Net, $142,120, $789 per acre. He wrote that figure down and held it next to what cotton had been doing on comparable ground in the mid-1990s. Dale Pruitt's cotton net had compressed to somewhere between $210 and $240 per acre by 1996, squeezed from both ends by a farm price environment that had not cooperated with anyone running an annual crop on declining water. The gap between the two columns was not subtle. It was not something you could explain away by arguing about methodology or projections. It was $789 against $225, and both numbers were real. Break-even arrived in the 3rd cutting, mid-August 1996. Not at year-end. Not after the accountant had run the annual summary. In the 3rd cutting, mid-season, the cumulative revenue from the field crossed the cumulative cost of conversion, including the negative $180 establishment year of 1994, carried forward and settled. George opened the notebook. He wrote the actual figures in beside the projections he had made 32 months earlier at the kitchen table in November of 1993. The 2 columns ran almost identical. Establishment loss in year 1 within $8. Year 2 net within $11. Year 3 break even, 3rd cutting. He had written 3rd cutting. It broke even in the 3rd cutting. He had not been lucky. He had not caught a favorable price swing or benefited from an input cost that moved in an unexpected direction. The model had worked because the model had been built carefully, on a decade's worth of question rather than a season's worth of hope. He closed the notebook and set it on the table where he had first opened it. Outside, the pivot ran quietly over a field that had answered every question he had thought to ask it. The summer of 1996 turned hard in July and did not soften through August. It was not a historic drought, not the kind that gets named and remembered for a generation. It was the quieter kind, a July and August running hotter than normal and drier than normal. The kind of summer that does not announce itself as a catastrophe until the cotton is already behind and the pivots are already running full sets, trying to recover something that cannot quite be recovered. Across Lubbock County that year, cotton yields averaged 720 pounds of lint per acre, against a normal of 900. The pivots ran through August on every cotton operation in the county, pulling harder from an aquifer that was already declining, chasing a crop through its bowl-fill window in heat that was not cooperating. George's field stood differently in the dry weeks. The alfalfa taproot system, 2.5 years established by that August, was pulling from a depth that the seasonal dryness had not yet reached. The subsoil moisture that cotton roots had never accessed was still there, below the zone where the summer heat was making its demands. George did not need to increase his irrigation frequency during the dry stretch. The crop was not under the same stress because it was not drawing from the same part of the soil profile that the drought was affecting. His fourth cutting in late August came in slightly below his season average. The dry heat had done something, even to alfalfa at that depth, over that many weeks, but it came in within the range his supply contract covered. He delivered. He was paid. The contract held because the crop held, and the crop held because the root system was doing what a 2.5-year-old root system does. He had not written the 1996 drought into the November 1993 notebook. It had not been a variable he had specifically planned for. The calculation he had made at the kitchen table had been about water efficiency, about pumping costs, about the aquifer declining and the electrical bill rising. Drought resilience had not been a line item. But the characteristic that made alfalfa water efficient under normal conditions, the deep taproot reaching moisture that seasonal evaporation and crop demand had not yet drawn down, was the same characteristic that provided insulation when the season ran abnormally dry. The planning had been done for one reason. The protection arrived for the same reason, from a direction he had not specifically anticipated. This is what a long planning horizon does, that a short one cannot. When you are thinking in decades rather than seasons, the decisions you make for the risks you can see tend to cover some of the risks you cannot see, because the underlying logic is sound enough to hold in conditions it was never specifically designed for. George had not foreseen the summer of 1996. He had simply built something deep enough to survive it. Dale Pruitt sold in the spring of 1998. The news came through the same county grapevine that had carried the verdict 4 years earlier, the one about George throwing good ground away on hay. It traveled the same co-ops and fuel stops and fence line conversations, and it arrived with the particular weight that attaches to news nobody wanted to be true. Dale's ground was better than George's. That was not a matter of opinion. It was flatter, the subsoil ran deeper, the salinity profile was cleaner, and under good conditions, it had the yield potential that George's ground had never quite matched. Dale had not been farming poor ground. He had not been farming it carelessly or without knowledge or without effort. He had been doing what cotton farmers in Lubbock County did, committing his inputs every March, running his pivot through the critical window, delivering to the gin, servicing his note, and doing it again the following year. The cotton price weakness that had been building through 1996 and 1997 had not created a catastrophe in any single season. It had done something quieter and harder to defend against. It had compressed Dale's net margin a little further each year, until the operating note at the bank could no longer be serviced from what the crop was returning. There was no blowout year, no single failure that could be identified and corrected. There was just the annual reset, the same cost committed every spring against a revenue line that had been declining for 4 years without finding a floor. until the gap between what the operation required and what it produced could no longer be bridged. The ground had not failed Dale. The ground was the same ground it had always been, flat and deep and capable. The structure had failed him. The structure that reset to zero every March, regardless of what the previous year had given, that demanded full input commitment before a single price was known, that carried no accumulated advantage from one season into the next, that structure had run out of margin to absorb. George heard about the sale the way he had heard about the laughter in 1994, through the grapevine secondhand, without being present for the original conversation. He did not say anything about it to anyone. There was nothing to say that the situation had not already said more clearly than he could. Dale was a good farmer. His ground was good ground. The outcome was not a referendum on his ability or his effort. It was what happens when the planning horizon is short enough that 4 consecutive years of price compression have nowhere to go except through the operating note and out the other side. George drove back out to the field. The stand was in its 5th year, a taproot system running deep into ground that had been answering his questions reliably since the 3rd cutting of 1996. He ran the mower and did not say anything to anyone. If this story has been worth your time, and I believe it has, hit the like button before you go. Share it with someone who farms, or who thinks about farming, or who has ever had to make a decision that looked wrong for 2 years before it looked right. Subscribe if you haven't. There is more coming, and it is worth being here for. In the fall of 2000, George dissed the stand down and reseeded. 6 years was a good run for an alfalfa stand. The root system had given what it had to give. The production curve had begun its natural decline, and the agronomically correct decision was the one that cost money for a year before it made money again. He knew this. He had always known this was coming. He put the disc over the field in October, and the ground looked, once again, like a field between things. He sat down at the kitchen table with a new notebook. He already knew what the numbers would say before he wrote them. He had run this once. He had watched the actual figures land within $11 of the projections, watched break-even arrive in the 3rd cutting of the 3rd year, exactly where the first notebook had said it would arrive. The model had not been luck, and it had not been favorable conditions. It had been careful thinking about a long horizon. And careful thinking about a long horizon does not change its conclusions simply because a calendar has turned. Year 1 would look wrong to everyone driving past on the county road. The stand would be thin and establishing and unreadable to anyone measuring it against what the ground had produced at full production. Year 2 would bring the pressure to quit, and that pressure would be real, and the evidence available at the fence line in year 2 would point, as it always pointed, toward wrong. Year 3 would prove the math. He wrote it down anyway. All of it, in the same order he had written it in November of 1993. He dated the top of the page, October 14, 2000, and put the new notebook in the same drawer where the first one still sat. The 2 men who had stopped at the fence in the summer of 1994 and laughed and driven on were not farming anymore. George knew this without satisfaction and without comment. They had been good farmers on good ground, and the structure they had farmed inside had not held. That was the whole of it. George Groce was still farming. The same 180 acres, the same pivot, the same ground his father had broken before him. The horizon had not changed. The plan had not changed. The only thing that had changed was that he had already run it once and knew, with the particular certainty that comes from having been right about something that looked wrong for 2 years, exactly what the next 3 years would say. He put the notebook in the drawer. In the spring, he started the tractor and drove out to the field and did not look at the road.